Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that is equal parts philosophy, history, and, well, what I can only describe as a psychological thriller.
It really is.
Hmm.
It's a story about a boy who was built, literally engineered to be a machine, who then broke down and then spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how human beings actually work.
We are talking about John Stuart Mill. And if you know the name from a college textbook, you probably know him as the champion of liberty, the utilitarian guy.
The do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone philosopher.
Exactly. But the sources we have today paint a much more complex, almost tragic picture. We're looking at his attempt to create nothing less than a science of society.
Which is a massive, massive ambition. To take the chaos of human history, the wars, the revolutions, the confusing mess of daily life, and try to find hard scientific laws that govern it all.
It really is. And we're drawing from a really dense, fascinating collection of his writings on history, logic, and his own autobiography. But before we get to the heavy theory, to the system of logic, we have to start with the man himself. Because his childhood, well, frankly, it sounds like a science fiction experiment.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
You can't understand Mill's theories on history if you don't understand the laboratory he grew up in.
Yeah.
So he was born in 1806, the eldest son of James Mill. And James Mill wasn't just, a dad. He was a disciple, a close friend, and a collaborator of Jeremy Bentham.
The father of utilitarianism, the big guy.
Right. And together, James Mill and Jeremy Bentham decided to give young John Stuart Mill a formidable early education. And that's the phrase from the text, but formidable. That is putting it so lightly. It was an experiment in manufacturing a genius.
Yeah, I was reading the notes on this and I had to double check the ages. He started learning Greek at age 3. 3 years old. Most 3-year-olds are, learning not to eat crayons, and he's learning the Greek alphabet.
By the time he was 8, he had read Aesop's Fables, Xenophon's Anabasis, and the whole of Herodotus in the original Greek.
Wow.
He'd go on these walks in the lanes around their house with his father, just reciting what he had learned. He was like a walking hard drive for his father's intellect.
And it wasn't just languages. By the time he was a teenager, he had mastered Latin, higher mathematics, logic, political economy.
He was a terrifyingly intelligent child prodigy.
Yeah.
I mean, he was editing Bentham's manuscripts when other kids were, playing hoop and stick.
But here's the catch, and this is the crucial part. The education was designed to make him a reasoning machine. It was purely intellectual. And the sources highlight something very specific that was missing.
Contact with other children.
That's the part that got me. No play dates, no tag, just Greek verbs and logic puzzles with his dad. He was completely isolated.
And no emotional development whatsoever. The goal was to create the perfect utilitarian successor, someone who could look at the world, calculate the greatest good for the greatest number, and then just execute the program. He was, in a very real sense, the robot child who woke up.
And that waking up is the inciting incident for everything we're going to talk about today. Because in 1826, when he was just 20 years old, the machine crashed.
He calls it his famous revulsion. It was a severe mental health crisis, a really deep depression. He looked at his life and he looked at the worldview he had been force-fed, this whole Benthamite outlook.
So let's unpack that Benthamite outlook for a second. What was he actually revolting against? Because on the surface, utilitarianism, creating the most happiness, that sounds pretty good.
It sounds nice, sure. But the version his father taught him was incredibly mechanical. He was revolting against the idea that humans are just pleasure-seeking calculators. Bentham and James Mill viewed people almost like interchangeable units.
Right, like cogs in a machine.
Exactly. You put in a stimulus, you get a response. If you want to stop crime, you just adjust the pain setting on the punishment. It was a very dry, very mechanical view of what it means to be human.
It just strips away all the poetry, the mystery, the weirdness of being a person.
All of it. And so in 1826, John Stuart Mill asks himself this famous question. He sits down and he thinks, suppose that all your objects in life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you were looking forward to could be completely affected at this very instant. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you?
And his answer?
His answer was an irrepressible no.
Wow.
He realized he was mechanically pushing for all these goals, but he felt nothing. He was completely empty. The logic was there, but the engine, the emotion, was dead.
That's the classic does not compute moment. It's the robot realizing it doesn't have a soul.
Precisely. He realized that seeing humans as simple logical engines wasn't just depressing, it was factually wrong. So where did he go? He didn't just throw away logic, but he pivoted. The text says he turned to the Romantic school poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Which is the polar opposite of Bentham. That's
Yeah.
all about emotion, feeling, the messy internal life, looking at a flower and feeling something profound.
Right. And this really sets up the mission of our deep dive today. Mill didn't just become a poet and abandon his father's work. He tried to merge these two worlds. He wanted to take the rigorous logic of his father and combine it with the messy, emotional, historical reality of the Romantics. He wanted to build a science of society that was actually accurate to how humans behave, not how a calculator behaves.
So instead of a sterile lab, he wanted to study the wild jungle of human history, but apply scientific tools to it.
That's a great way to put it. He wanted to understand the laws of the jungle.
But that brings us to the first big hurdle, right? Which we're calling the impossible science. Because, look, I can predict what a billiard ball will do if I hit it. Physics is consistent. Gravity is consistent. But humans, we're irrational, emotional, weird. Can you really have a science of history?
This was the exact skepticism Mill had to address. And to do it, he had to first dismantle the old utilitarianism of his father.
The text mentions that his father and Bentham thought they could just deduce politics from the laws of human nature.
Right. They thought, okay, humans like pleasure and dislike pain. Therefore, if we set up a government this way, everyone will do that. It was like geometry to them.
If A, then B.
Exactly. They thought they could design a perfect constitution for any country on Earth without ever visiting it, just by sitting in a room and using logic.
That sounds incredibly arrogant.
It was, and Mill says it's complete nonsense.
So why? What was his argument?
He realized you cannot treat politics like geometry because universal man doesn't exist. A person living in 1800s London behaves differently than a person in ancient Rome or a person in feudal Japan. You can't just have one simple formula for everyone because the variables inside the person, their beliefs, their habits, their culture, have changed.
Right, because we are shaped by our society. We aren't just born as generic humans. We are born as 21st century Americans or 19th century Russians or ancient Greeks.
Exactly. Mill recognized that people are subject to varying moral, educational, and economical influences. So to have a science of society, you can't just look at individual psychology and avoid. You have to look at the society itself. You have to study the context.
And this is where he brings in some heavy hitters from French
Sure.
philosophy, right? This guy, Auguste Comte.
Yes, Comte is a huge influence here. Now, Mill didn't agree with everything Comte said. Comte got a little cult-like later in life. But Mill borrowed two massive concepts that really define this new science: social statics and social dynamics.
Okay, let's break these down. They sound like physics terms. Social statics first.
That's the idea. Social statics is the study of the state of society at a single point in time. It's like taking a snapshot or freezing the movie.
And what are we looking for in that snapshot? What's the point?
We're looking for the consensus. This is a crucial word for Mill. It means that in any given era, everything is connected. The state of knowledge, the type of government, the religion, the technology, the economy, they all hang together in a kind of equilibrium.
So you can't just swap out one part. Like you can't just plug and play a different government.
No. Imagine taking a modern digital stock exchange and trying to drop it into the middle of the Viking Age.
It wouldn't work, and not just because of the lack of electricity.
Right. It wouldn't work because the very concept of a stock exchange relies on a certain level of trust, a complex legal system, a specific type of currency, mass literacy, a global view of trade. The consensus of the Viking Age, which was based on rating, loyalty to a chieftain, a totally different economic structure, it just couldn't support it.
The pieces wouldn't fit. The software is incompatible with the hardware.
Exactly. The text implies this really well. You can't have a modern representative democracy if your population is uneducated and living in feudal poverty. The pieces wouldn't fit. The state of society has a uniform character. The government reflects the people reflect the religion, and so on.
That makes a lot of sense. Everything coexists. It's like an ecosystem. You can't just introduce a polar bear into the Amazon rainforest and expect it to work out.
Perfect analogy. That's social statics, understanding the ecosystem at a specific moment. But of course, history isn't just a snapshot. It moves. The ecosystem changes.
And that, I'm guessing, is social dynamics.
You got it. If statics is the snapshot, dynamics is the movie. It's the study of progress. How does one state of society turn into the next one? How do we get from the Viking Age to the stock exchange age?
And this is where the text gets into this really cool analogy about astronomy. The difference between an orbit and a trajectory.
Yes. This is a vital distinction Mill makes between the old way of thinking and the new. There was an Italian philosopher named Vico who believed history moved in an orbit.
Like a planet circling the sun, meaning it repeats itself.
Right. Vico looked at history and just saw cycles. Empires rise, empires fall. Democracy turns into tyranny, which turns into aristocracy, which turns back into democracy. It's a loop. You always end up back where you started.
Which implies that human nature is just fixed and we just keep making the same mistakes and having the same successes forever?
And Mill says no.
He rejects that completely.
He and Comp say no. They argue that history is a trajectory. It's a line, not a circle. It moves forward.
Okay, but does forward necessarily mean better? Because, looking at history, there are plenty of times where things got a lot worse. The Dark Ages, for example.
That's a very important point, and Mill is careful here. He says the general tendency is toward advancement. It doesn't mean every single year is better than the last. There are setbacks. There are collapsed civilizations. But if you zoom out, humanity accumulates knowledge.
Right. We don't really unlearn things on a grand scale.
Generally, no. We don't unlearn fire or the wheel or electricity or the germ theory of disease. Even when an empire falls, the knowledge tends to be preserved somewhere or rediscovered relatively quickly. So unlike a planet that returns to the exact same spot in its orbit, society is always moving to a new spot, even if the path is really bumpy. We are, in some sense, standing on a higher mountain of knowledge than the Romans were.
Okay, so we have the snapshot, which is statics, and the movie, which is dynamics. We know history moves in a trajectory, but the big question, the one that Mill was obsessed with, is how? How do we figure out the rules of this movement? If I want to be a scientist of history, how do I actually study it?
This leads us directly to the method, and this is where Mill gets really, really clever. He creates something he calls the Inverse Deductive Method.
Inverse Deductive Method. That sounds incredibly academic. I'm not going to lie, it sounds like something I'd skip in a textbook.
It does, but stick with me, because the logic is actually beautiful. Mill identifies two big traps that he wants to avoid. He's trying to navigate between the pure data nerds and the pure theory nerds. Trap number one is what he calls strict observation.
Which is just looking at history and, taking notes. The empirical method?
Right. The chemical method, he sometimes called it. If you just look at history, it's a total mess. Let's say you want to know what causes a revolution. You look at the French Revolution. Okay, you have a weak king, a famine, and new ideas from the Enlightenment. But you also have specific people, specific weather patterns, specific coincidences.
You can't run a controlled experiment on it.
Exactly. You can't say, okay, let's run the French Revolution again, but this time let's make King Louis a bit smarter and see if he keeps his head. You can't isolate the variables. History is just too complex. So purely empirical observation fails because you can never be sure what actually caused the event.
It's basically just a collection of anecdotes.
Yes. So that's trap one. Trap number two is the opposite, strict deduction. This was his father's trap.
Sitting in a room and guessing how humans behave based on pure logic.
Which fails because humans aren't logical robots, as Mill learned the hard, painful way.
Okay, so observation alone is messy, and logic alone is blind. What's the solution?
Mill says, we need a sandwich. We need to combine them. It's a two-step verification process. Step one, observe the historical trend. Find an empirical law.
Okay, give me an example.
All right, let's say you look at history and you notice a pattern. It seems that as societies get more industrial, they also get more democratic. You see it in England, you see it in America, you see it in parts of Europe. It's a trend you can observe.
Okay, so that's the observation, but that's just a correlation, right? It's not a proof. Maybe it's just a coincidence.
Exactly. It could be totally random. So you need step two, verification. You have to take that historical trend and check it against the fundamental laws of human nature. You have to ask, does this make sense psychologically?
Ah, I see. So you have to go into the human brain. You ask, is there something in the human psyche that makes us want more freedom when we become more economically independent and educated?
Yes. You use psychology to explain the history. If you can say, well, yes, basic human psychology tells us that people desire autonomy when they have the means to support themselves and are more aware of the world, then you've unlocked the puzzle. You've connected the big historical trend back to the basic laws of individual psychology.
You've anchored the history in the brain, the macro in the micro.
Exactly. Then and only then do you have a scientific law of society. You've bridged that gap between the two traps.
That's really smart. It keeps you honest. You can't just make up grand theories without evidence, but you also can't just trust the evidence without an explanation.
And Mill even proposed a specific science for this bridge, this connection. He called it ethology.
Ethology. like the study of animal behavior.
In modern terms, yes, we use that word for animals, but Mill actually coined it first, and for him, he meant the science of character formation.
The science of character formation, what does that mean?
He wanted to study exactly how social circumstances create individual character. He saw it like this. We have psychology, which are the basic laws of the mind. Then we have sociology, the laws of the group. Ethology was supposed to be the missing link. How does the group environment rewrite the individual mind?
So, how does growing up in a Spartan military camp create a different type of personality than growing up in a San Francisco commune in the 60s?
Exactly that. Mill believed that if we could master this science, if we could really understand how character is formed, we could basically engineer a better society. We could create an education system that produces wiser, kinder, more rational people.
He never actually finished that book, did he?
No, he didn't. Ethology remains the great missing science. We still argue about it today, nature versus nurture. Mill was convinced nurture, the environment, was the key, and he wanted to find the formula.
So, we have the method. We look at the trends, we check them against our brains. Now let's talk about the engine. If society is a car moving down this trajectory, what is the motor? What actually drives change?
This is one of Mill's most definitive and, I think, most controversial claims. And it might surprise some people today who are so used to thinking about economics or technology as the driver of everything. Mill asks, what is the one thing that changes the most and changes everything else with it? His answer, the speculative faculties of mankind.
Speculative faculty, that's a very fancy 19th century way of saying what we think, our ideas, our beliefs.
Our knowledge and our beliefs. Mill argues very forcefully that ideas are the prime mover of history.
Wait, hold on. So not money, not resources, not who has the most guns or the best technology.
Mill acknowledges that all those material conditions, industry, government, geography, are hugely important, but he argues they are ultimately downstream of knowledge and belief. Well, think about it. Why do we have industry? Because someone had an idea about how to manipulate nature. The steam engine didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of accumulated knowledge in physics and engineering. Why do we have a specific type of government? Because of the prevailing beliefs about justice, authority, and human rights.
So if you change the knowledge, you change the beliefs. And if you change the beliefs, you change the society.
Exactly. It's a chain reaction.
Yep.
The source text uses a really powerful example, religion. Mill points out that the shift from polytheism to Judaism, then to Christianity, and then the split to Protestantism, these weren't just changes in where we go on Sunday. They fundamentally altered the entire fabric of society.
Walk me through that. How does that work?
Well, think about a polytheistic worldview. The world is full of capricious, unpredictable gods. The river has a god, the mountain has a god, the sky has a god. You have to appease all of them. The social structure that results from that is fragmented, it's local, it's deeply superstitious. Then you move to monotheism. One God, one law, a universal truth that applies to everyone. Suddenly, you have a framework for universal laws on earth. You have the concept of the individual soul being equal before God. And that eventually leads to the concept of individual rights.
So without the theological shift, you don't get the political shift later on.
Correct. Mill argues that the intellectual change, the change in belief, always precedes the major social change. It's like a software update theory of history. You update the operating system, the beliefs, and the hardware, the society starts running differently.
That's a perfect analogy. And Mill, following Comte again, believed there was a specific pattern to these software updates. This is the famous law of 3 stages.
I love this concept. It's a little rigid, maybe, but it's such a great lens to view history through. Mill accepted Comte's view that human thought as a whole evolves through 3 distinct phases. Stage 1, the theological.
This is explaining the world via gods or supernatural agents. Thunder is Thor hitting his hammer, that kind of thing.
Right. Why is there a plague? Because we angered Apollo. In this stage, the human mind explains everything by projecting its own personality and will onto nature. And society reflects that. You get absolute monarchs, god-kings, and a demand for total obedience to divine will.
Okay, stage 1. What's stage 2?
Stage 2, the metaphysical.
This one is always a bit trickier to grasp. It sounds like crystals and incense.
It's not quite that kind of metaphysical. It's a transition phase. Instead of explaining things with gods, you use abstract forces or entities. You stop saying, Zeus made the thunder, and you start saying things like, Nature abhors a vacuum, or the vital force causes life.
Ah, so it's not a person, but it's not quite science yet either.
Exactly. And politically, this is the Enlightenment era. People start talking about the rights of man or the social contract. These are abstract entities. They aren't scientific facts you can measure in a lab, but they aren't gods either. It's a philosophy stage.
And then stage 3, the positive.
The positive, or scientific stage. This is where you explain the world via observation and verifiable laws. Thunder is sound waves caused by the rapid expansion of air due to electrical discharge. We stop asking why. In the old sense, why did the god do this? And we start asking how. How does this mechanism work?
And Mill believed that as human thought moves from theological to metaphysical to positive, society must change along with it.
It has to. You can't have a population that thinks scientifically but lives under a theological government.
Yeah.
So if we're in the positive stage of thought, we should be building a positive society, a society run on reason, evidence, and science.
That was the dream anyway. An epistocracy, a rule by the wise, or at least a very rational democracy.
That was the goal. And this evolution of thought is the fundamental law that dictates social progress. If you want to know where a society is going, Mill says, look at what its smartest people are thinking about.
It's a very optimistic view of the intellect. It basically says we get smarter, so we get better.
It is optimistic. And it places a huge burden on intellectuals and thinkers. Because in this model, they are the ones driving the car. If the thinkers get it wrong, society drives off a cliff.
But hold on. We've built up this system where ideas and general laws drive history. It all feels very orderly, very neat.
Yep.
But then, as Mill is writing all this, he gets blindsided by a completely different kind of science that throws a wrench in the works. This brings us to the spookiest part of the reading for me, the mystery of the unaddressed letters.
Ah, yes. The Buckle controversy. This is where the story takes a sharp turn into something that feels like the Matrix.
So introduce us to this Mr. Buckle.
Henry Thomas Buckle wrote a massive book called History of Civilization that came out around the same time Mill was writing. And Buckle was obsessed with the new science of statistics.
Right.
We have to remember, in the mid-19th century, governments were just starting to collect massive amounts of data. Births, deaths, crimes, taxes. It was a birth of big data. And Buckle looked at the spreadsheets and he saw something that, well, it terrified him.
The regularity.
The frightening regularity. He looked at murder rates. Now, murder seems like the most personal, chaotic, individual act possible. It's a crime of passion, or a terrible mistake, or a specific evil plan.
It's not something you'd think of as predictable.
Not at all. But Buckle found that year after year, in a country like France or England, the number of murders was nearly constant. And not just the total number, he broke it down by the types of weapons used. A certain number of stabbings, a certain number of shootings. It remained stable, like a law of physics.
And then the kicker, the post office.
This is the detail that really stuck with me from the sources. Buckle looked at the London post office, and he counted how many people dropped a letter into the mailbox without writing an address on it.
That is the definition of a random, clumsy mistake. You're in a rush, you're distracted.
It's pure chaos. It's a brain fart. You'd think it would be completely unpredictable.
You'd think so.
But Buckle said, look at the numbers. It's not chaos at all. It's a law. The number of unaddressed letters was statistically constant every single year. It was predictable.
Okay, that's genuinely weird.
So Buckle threw down a provocation. If I can predict mathematically how many people will commit murder this year, or how many people will forget to address a letter, do those people actually have a choice?
Oof. Yeah, that hits hard. If the statistics say 300 people must forget their address this year, are you just a cog in the machine fulfilling that quota when you do it?
That was the terrifying implication. It suggested that free will is an illusion. We think we are choosing, but really the general state of society, the poverty levels, the education, the sheer rush of the city creates a pressure, and we just act it out. We are puppets of the statistics.
This is a full-blown existential crisis. I mean, if I'm just a statistic, do I even matter? How did Mill handle this? Because he's trying to build a science, so he loves the idea of laws, but he also loves liberty and individual choice more than anything.
Mill steps in as the voice of reason here.
Yeah.
He defends free will, but in a very nuanced, very clever way. He distinguishes between the mass and the individual. He uses what we now call the law of large numbers.
Okay, so how does that work?
Mill says, look, Buckle is right about the group. General causes, like poverty, education levels, cultural norms, they act on the whole population. They create a probability. In a group of 10 million people, those pressures will inevitably cause some people to crack and commit a crime. or cause some people to be distracted and forget an address.
So the total number is predictable. The quota exists for the group.
A quote exists for the group, yes, but, and this is the absolute key, those general causes do not compel any specific individual to do it. You, John Doe, are not forced by the universe to rob that bank. You have agency. You can choose not to. But in a crowd of 10 million John Does, the probability says that someone will.
I see. So the system determines the rate of the behavior, but the individual still determines who does it.
Precisely. The source text uses this weather analogy, which I think is perfect for explaining it. We can predict, with a high degree of certainty, the average temperature of next July. We know we'll be hotter than December. That's the general cause, the season, the orbit of the Earth, the climate. But we cannot predict that a specific thunderstorm will hit your house on July 14th at 2:00 p.m. That depends on local, specific, unpredictable conditions. The weather.
So history is the climate, but our individual lives are the weather.
That is a beautiful summary. Mill saves free will by saying, the climate sets the boundaries and the averages, but within those boundaries, the storms of individual life are free to happen. You can put up a lightning rod, you can choose to go inside. You still have a choice.
That is a relief. I am not just a number in Mr. Buckle's spreadsheet. I might be influenced by the temperature, but I'm not controlled by it.
You are not. Buckle wasn't quite done. He had another argument that challenged Mill's worldview, and this one was about great men.
Right. Segment 5, the great man theory. Or in Buckle's case, the great men don't matter theory. He basically argued that individual heroes, the Caesars, the Newtons, the Napoleons, don't actually matter in the long run.
Exactly. Buckle's view was extreme determinism. He said, look, if the general causes and the statistics are everything, then individuals are, well, nothing. He argued that if Isaac Newton hadn't been born, someone else would have discovered calculus.
Because the state of society was ready for it. The math was there, the knowledge was there. Newton was just the guy who got to the finish line first.
Yes. And if Martin Luther hadn't lived, the Reformation would have happened anyway because the church was corrupt and the printing press existed. The powder keg was already there. Luther was just the match. Any match would have done the job.
So he thinks great men are labels we put on historical trends. Like, they are surfing a giant wave, but they didn't create the wave.
That's his view. He thinks they're interchangeable parts.
And what did Mill say to that?
Mill pushes back hard. He agrees that the general causes are the main tide. You know, you can't have a computer revolution in the Middle Ages no matter how smart you are. The tide isn't ready for that. But Mill argues that individuals can act as accelerators or as dams.
I love the hilltop analogy he uses for this.
It's so good. Mill compares a genius to a person standing on a hilltop watching the sunrise. The person on the hill sees the sun, the truth, before the people down in the valley. Now, eventually, the sun will rise high enough for everyone in the valley to see it. That part is inevitable. That's the general trend. But the genius sees it sooner. And by seeing it sooner, they can point it out, they can explain it, they can speed up the whole process.
So Newton didn't invent gravity, but he helped us see it and understand it maybe 100 years earlier than we might have otherwise.
Exactly. And that 100 years matters. That's a century of extra progress, extra medicine, extra technology that we wouldn't have had. History isn't just about what happens, it's about when it happens. A delay of 500 years can mean the difference between life and death for millions of people.
And Mill goes further than that. He says there are specific moments in history where a single person's decision changed everything. Not just the timing, but the actual direction of the river. He uses the example of Themistocles.
The Greek general. Yeah.
At the Battle of Salamis.
Right. This was the pivotal moment where the tiny Greek states were fighting the massive Persian Empire. And it was on a razor's edge. The Greeks were terrified. They wanted to retreat. Themistocles, through sheer force of will, trickery, and brilliant strategy, forced the Greeks to stand and fight, and they won an impossible victory.
So Mill asks the question, what if Themistocles hadn't been there? What if he had been a coward? Or just slightly less clever?
The Greeks likely lose. The Persians win. And if the Persians win, Athens is burned to the ground. If Athens is burned, the golden age of Athens doesn't happen. Maybe we don't get Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Maybe we don't get the seeds of Western democracy and science as we know them.
You can't just say, oh, someone else would have done it.
Maybe no one else would have. Maybe the torch would have just gone out. That's the butterfly effect. A single general, a single decision on a single afternoon, and the next 2,000 years of history look completely different.
And then Mill shows the dark side of this, the dam.
Exactly. If a great man can be an accelerator, a bad man or a bad institution can stop progress cold. He points to Spain.
The Spanish Reformation, or I guess the lack of one.
Right. Buckle's theory would say, progress is inevitable. Truth always wins out. Spain would have modernized eventually, Mill says. Look at the Inquisition. The Reformation tried to break out in Spain. There were people ready for it, the ideas were there, but the Inquisition was a specific institution run by specific people that systematically and brutally crushed those thinkers. They burned them, they exiled them,
They didn't just delay progress.
they killed it. And Spain stagnated for centuries compared to the rest of Europe. It fell behind.
That is a chilling point. Progress is not a guarantee. It isn't some magical escalator that only goes up. It can be broken.
It can be. Mill's lesson here is that while the trajectory of history is generally forward, it is not automatic. It requires agents. It requires us. We are the makers of history, constrained by the materials we have, our era and our culture. But we are the builders.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. From the robot child who learned to feel, to the orbit versus trajectory, to the unaddressed letters, and finally to the great men on the hilltop. If we had to synthesize Mill's whole vision, this science of society, what is the big takeaway?
The takeaway is balance. Mill is trying to navigate between two extremes that we still fight about today. On one side, you have the scientific determinists, the people who think everything is data, algorithms, and market forces, and that we are just helpless passengers.
It's the economy's stupid crowd.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have the romantics, who think everything is about individual will and heroics, and they ignore the powerful systems we live in. Mill comes down the middle and says, both of you are wrong.
We are not puppets of destiny, but we aren't gods either.
That's it perfectly. History follows laws. Laws of psychology, laws of social development. We are swimming in a powerful current. We can't just decide to swim anywhere we want. We can't swim to the moon, but we are swimmers, not just drift logs. We can choose to swim with the current, against it, or try to steer toward the shore. And occasionally, a really strong swimmer, a Newton, a Caesar, or maybe even a listener today, can actually change the course of the entire river.
That is a surprisingly empowering thought from a guy who started out as a logic machine. It really feels like he finally reconciled his father's science with his own need for humanity.
He did. He humanized the science of society without losing the logic.
So here's my final thought for you, the listener. Mill argues that ideas drive history. Not just technology, but the beliefs and the philosophy behind the technology. We are living in a time of massive technological change, AI, space travel, biotech. But if Mill is right, the thing that will actually define our future isn't the tech itself. It's the speculative idea we develop to understand it and to guide it. So what is the new polytheism to monotheism level idea that is shifting under our feet right now? What is the new belief system that's forming in the quiet corners of the internet or in labs that will change the social fabric of the 22nd century more than any single gadget?
That is the question. And remember, according to Mill, you're not just watching the answer unfold. You're helping to write it.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.